Well, my name is Jack Newman. I live in Sherwood Park, but I did live in Fort Vermilion on the farm for probably 60 years. And we retired to Sherwood Park in 1998.
My name is Marilee, and I am from Fort Vermilion. And we are at the museum in Fort Vermilion, which has become a bit of a second home for me over the last 20 years. We moved up to this area. I moved up to this area in 1974 to farm with my husband, who had purchased a farm along with a couple of other people in 1971. The first growing of crops in the area was relating to subsistence around the fur trade posts. So they may not have been considered farmers per se, but they were people that did start to grow horticultural crops, and very soon thereafter some cereal grains. So we had both the Northwest Company and Hudson's Bay Company posts that were primary in the region, and the first horticultural crops that were grown here was at a post across the river from here, about 4 miles downstream, and that post was established by a man called Charles Boyer. And when Alexander Mackenzie came through this community in 1792, he recorded the vegetables that were growing in the garden at Boyer's post, and they were largely root crops. From then on, there was a succession of fur trade posts up and down the river, and the information that we have from the fur trade journals is that there was cereals growing at the post that was called Fort Vermilion 1, or Lafleur's post. That one was established in 1798 and really existed right through until the amalgamation of the two companies. And at that time, we learned that there were not only potatoes growing at that post, but that there was also cause for bringing in a patent flour mill. So we know that if they were bringing in a flour mill, they were producing enough grain in order to produce flour.
Well, farming in the early years was quite a bit different than now, because farms were smaller to begin with, of course, and they were more sort of self-sustaining, if you like. Everybody had a few cows and other livestock, and the cash crops that they did have were marketed with some difficulty, because we were a long ways away, and until the highways improved in the early 50s, and they involved, of course, for the next 25, 30 years, there was no opportunity to market a lot of crop, specialty crops like alfalfa seed, some flax crops, and occasionally some wheat.
Beginnings of the experimental farm are credited to Fred Lauren. And Robert Jones was the first official superintendent of the experimental farm, and he held that position until 1933. From 1936 on, the experimental farm at its current location was established.
Well, I started to work in 1951 in January, and my first role was actually seeding the fields and working with the equipment. But the officer in charge at that particular time required somebody to do plot work, and I was interested in doing that, and so for the rest of my time at the station here, I was in charge of plots, primarily the cereal and oil seeds section, but at times some of the forage and soils, but primarily it was cereal crops. And so I was technician from 1952 till 1964 when I left to go back to actual farming as a producer. Most of the crops were variety trials in both forage and cereals. Oilseeds came in a bit later. And by and large, it was evaluating the varieties to their suitability for this area. And so that if producers wanted to, improve their seed stocks, we would have some information as to what would work here and what was not suitable. We did get into a flax breeding program because flax did well here, and it was a fairly high-priced crop. So we, in cooperation with the Central Experimental Farm, we started breeding. And it was licensed as a variety in the mid-60s, called Noralta. And amazingly enough, it was quite adaptable in much of Western Canada.
What I am most familiar with are two varieties that were developed, selected and developed here. And one of those maybe Jack Newman spoke about because I believe he was working at the farm at that time. But it was Noralta flax, they called it Noralta flax, and Peace alfalfa. And those were two significant crops that were produced as a result of work here. I'm sure there was a lot more. I believe that a lot of work was done with leafcutter bees, and I don't know if that we could go so far as to say it was cutting edge, but for this location and the northerly latitude again, it was quite the reason for the leafcutter bee work was because of their pollination factor and the importance of forages in the rotations of farming. Experimental Farm did not restrict its activities to just here in Fort Vermilion. It had plots elsewhere through different periods of its history. So they had plots as far south as Keg River and Manning, but they also went up to the Northwest Territories. So they had plots at Fort Smith, Fort Resolution, and even Fort Simpson. And I think we even have photos on file here that show some work at Norman Wells.
It was important to local producers because they had a source of information on crops and what they could do. We didn't. And in the oilseed sections, we grew a crop, an oilseed crop called Camelina, I believe it was, back in the late 50s, early 60s. And there was very little market for it, but we found that it could grow. And I have noticed in some of the agriculture papers now that it's actually been growing in parts of, and we did another oilseed crop called safflower, which is grown in southern Alberta. We could grow it here, but it was very much on the iffy side, and it never became a crop. So there was the early years. It was the livestock, providing some breeding stock and that type of thing. The information that came through the various trials, whether they be forage, cereals, and people could come and get some information. I think that this area, as a farming area, is unique in Canada, because anywhere else in Canada, there is not commercial farming like you find here at this latitude. And so the information that any kind of research is done here is important. Whether it be, like it's not necessarily basic research in that sense, but it's the applied, before farmers have to go in and do a lot of seeding on their own and trying to pick out stuff that does well in the central piece or in northern Alberta. We can grow crops here successfully. They can't grow in central Alberta, west of the QE highway to Calgary, because they're closer to the mountains, I guess, and whatever. And so we are unique here, and so any research done here is important to this area. Very important. It's important here because it supported the agricultural industry, which in turn supported the entire community. Indirectly, and of course it provided employment. But the basic intent of the station is, but it has to have not only the people who are hands-on in the research end or in the plot work and so on. You require a fair number of support staff, looking after grounds and then when the livestock were still on the station, of course, providing haying and all the work associated with maintaining a livestock herd. So it did do that, but it was important to provide information to people growing crops and gardens and that, so that they could grow them successfully and make a living. Oh yeah, the experimental farm always had an annual field day, and take people around to the plots and also the livestock when they had them, and show them, answer questions, and generally, it was an information thing. I think that same thing happens still today.
The research station was an integral part of this community. It was so because it was a major employer. That was pretty important. But it had a social element. It had a visitor information element. People wrote letters asking for what to grow and if they had some problems with insects, or the people at the research station were real resources. There was an extension of the research that was being done to the people of the area, and that was very, very important. Then it also served the capacity of school tours, much as we're doing here at the museum today, which is interesting because this museum wouldn't exist today if it hadn't been for the research station.